Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham. My wife is signaling me to move the microphone. I'm the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife and director, Lissa Muscatine, and we have a very topical and engaging program for you this evening, featuring Ira Shapiro. Here to talk about his new book, The Betrayal, How Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republicans Abandoned America. But first, a few brief housekeeping notes. Our mask requirement was reimposed today after DC's COVID rating went from green to yellow. So if you, let's see, I think you're all masked, but if you need one or want another one, we've got some at the front door. For the Q&A part of the talk this evening, if you have a question, just step up to this microphone right here. It's on the other side of the pillar from where most of you are sitting. And at the end of the event, our staff would greatly appreciate it if you'd fold up the chairs that you're sitting in and lean them against the pillar or bookcase somewhere. Now it's a pleasure to introduce Ira, who's spent several decades in Washington, first in politics and then focused on international trade. Back in the 1970s and 80s, he spent a dozen years in the Senate and served in some senior staff positions. He then moved into trade relations, working during the Clinton administration in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative, initially as general counsel and then as chief negotiator with Japan and Canada. He continued as a trade lawyer and became an international consultant. And for a time in the mid-2010s, he chaired the National Association of Japan-America Societies. Ira's new book follows two others that he's written about the Senate. The Last Great Senate, which was a pretty vivid portrait of that chamber in the late 1970s as a place of considerable accomplishment and inspiration. Then he came out with Broken, which traced the Senate's decline into a debilitating state of hyper-partisanship. In The Betrayal, Ira continues the story through the Trump years. The book's basic argument is that by neglecting to block Trump's abuses of power, and even at times aiding and abetting them, McConnell and his Republican colleagues are guilty of the most catastrophic failure of government in U.S. history. So yes, Ira doesn't mince words. His critique is blistering, but the fact is he has lots of compelling material to support his account of how time and again Senate Republicans under McConnell have put personal and party interests first. Now, as an added attraction, Ira will be in conversation here this evening with John Podesta, who, of course, is one of Washington's most experienced and skilled political advisors and operators. He's worked on both Capitol Hill and in the White House, most notably as Chief of Staff to President Clinton and counselor to President Obama. He founded and now chairs the Center for American Progress here in D.C., and he also teaches law at Georgetown University. So please join me in welcoming Ira Shapiro and John Podesta.
Well, we got special dispensation to take our masks off for as speakers, and it's a special treat for me to be here with Ira. Brad stole most of my material of introduction, but I'm gonna dive a little bit into where he left off, and just note particularly for the people who are watching this online, that the audience is filled with a lot of our friends who we worked with 40 years ago. So we were very young lawyers then, and had a lot of good times in a Senate that was very different than the one we're experiencing today. where people did put country above party, where they worked in a bipartisan way. Brad noted that Ira worked in the Senate for 12 years, and he worked for really some of the giants of the Senate. And I think it's worth just mentioning for Jacob Javits, for Gaylord Nelson, for Abe Ribicoff, for Tom Eagleton, for Robert Byrd, for Jay Rockefeller. And so, I mean, these were real heroes, and they really actually knew how to work together. I think we were, as I said, young lawyers there. But I want to start, Ira, by saying you had a career after that. You left the Senate when you were still pretty young, and went and served with great distinction in the Clinton administration, lead negotiator on the U.S.-Japan relationship, helped strengthen, resolve a lot of trade disputes and strengthen that alliance, which is so necessary today. Why do you keep going back to the Senate? Why 3 books on the Senate? Why not Japan? Why not trade? What fascinates you so much with the way the Senate has worked and the way it's working today?
That's a great question. First, I want to thank John for joining me here. I mean, I don't have to describe John's background. Everyone knows it. And if you think you know it, you don't know the half of John's impact over the past 30 years. I refer to him as the indispensable Democrat, and he's had extraordinary impact, and he continues to have extraordinary impact. So I'm thrilled that he's an old friend. I'm thrilled he'd be here. I will say that 10 years ago, when my first book came out, the first event I did was at the Center for American Progress, and John was my interlocutor there too. So I'm thrilled that he's here, and I'm thrilled to see so many friends. Great question. I've given more thought to the Senate than any reasonable person should. I got hooked on it early. One day after college graduation, I started as a Javits intern, and I found in the Senate a possible outlet for a concern I had about what I was going to do with my life, and a way to sort of think about making the country better. Spoiler alert, although my friends know this, I'm kind of old. I was there for the last constitutional crisis, the years of Vietnam that morphed into Watergate over time. And the Senate seemed to me to be a place where one could be a public servant and contribute something. So the 12 years understates it, because I spent years training, go to law school and training to be a Senate staffer. Other people wanted to be an astronaut or an actor. I wanted to be a Senate staffer. Why did I loop back? I mean, basically, the long decline of the Senate troubled me so much that right around when President Obama was first running, I was troubled by the decline of the Senate. And I started thinking about how to articulate what had been lost, and I decided the best way was to write about the last great Senate. Since you're friends, I will say that A, the last great Senate might have been the only great Senate. And B, there was no great Senate until I invented it. If you Google the words Great Senate, you will find nothing other than my book. But now there is a sort of an acceptance that the Senate was, of the 60s and the 70s, was kind of distinctive. And then I just sort of followed the arc of the Senate. I didn't give up the rest of my career, but I just found it to be fascinating. The one thing I'll add, John, is I didn't expect to write a third book. This one was prompted by the crisis of 2020, the catastrophic events facing the country, and my view that the Senate completely abandoned the country when it should have been checking Donald Trump on the pandemic and checking Donald Trump on the big lie.
Well, you're. By the way, I didn't point this out, but I mentioned that there are a lot of our friends from the Senate staff, Republicans and Democrats, sitting in the audience, and I think that's a testament to the way we work together and to a testament to the rapport that they hold and the esteem that they hold Ira in. Your second book, Broken, Can the Senate Save Itself and the Country? I guess you answered that in this book called The Betrayal, right? I guess the answer was no.
No, clearly the answer was no. But in fairness, the second book, which covered about the first 10 months of Trump, the second book was moderately optimistic, based on the fact that the Senate seemed to be very sensitive and aware of the Trump-Russia connection. They took strong action. The Senate narrowly, but did successfully stop McConnell in his effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So the book ended with a sort of moderate note of optimism. And to that extent, I was unduly optimistic. Nancy, my wife, would say that's quite characteristic, but I was unduly optimistic. And I wanted to write the third book to describe what had happened afterward.
Great, thanks. I want you to expound on something you kind of start the book with, which is a quote from James Madison, that the Senate is the great anchor of the government. You quote that favorably. What did he mean by that? And why do you come to that as a sort of anchor for your book?
Well, I didn't use it this time, did I? It was my last book, wasn't it? Hard to remember.
I don't think you could plagiarize yourself.
Well, look, you know the history, but the founders spent a lot of time trying to figure out the structure of government. They were quite ambivalent about the strength of the executive branch. On the one hand, they had seen the experience with the Articles of Confederation, so they wanted a strong president. But on the other hand, they feared a potential tyrant. They had just freed themselves from King George. So what was the answer? The answer was they came up with this unique set of checks and balances, of which the strong Senate was a key part. And their view was, Madison's view was, that the Senate was a group, that it would be a group of highly regarded men of stature who would have these 6-year terms, who would have the independence and stature in order to basically provide the balance in the government. They would balance the House if the House reflected the passions of the time. They would balance the president if the president turned out to be overreaching or corrupt. And they were supposed to be the balance wheel in the system, the anchor of the system.
And that's happened in history. The Republican Senate went after Harding, Howard Baker, Bill Cohen. Other Republicans went after Nixon.
So that's right. And look, John and I and many of you, having grown up with the Senate that stepped up during Watergate, we had a view, and I'll admit to an idealized view that carried me through much of 2019 and into 2020, that if things got bad enough, they would actually acknowledge their responsibility and do something. And in that regard, that's why their failure represented the betrayal, in my view.
Well, here's the kind of money line. The Senate Republican members did not just fail, they betrayed their oath of office, sacrificing American lives and American democracy. That's pretty harsh.
Well, I do think it's harsh, but I think it's accurate. And I didn't choose the term, there's a lot of betrayals around these days, and I didn't choose the term lightly. I based it on the fact that, number one, they had the responsibility. That's part of the deal. They have these extraordinary, prestigious jobs, the 6-year terms, the multiple terms. They can range over all the issues. But in return, they're supposed to exercise responsibility and focus on the nation's interest. And they failed that. And they failed it at a time of crisis in the country. They failed it when we had an unhinged president during a pandemic. And while the president was making it obvious that he wasn't going to accept the results of the election if he lost it. So if you put all that together, and I throw in one more ingredient, they roused themselves from their torpor eventually to ram through Amy Coney Barrett 8 days before the election. I think if you put all that together, they betrayed their oath of office.
A lot of that you put at the feet of McConnell. But
Yeah.
what do you think caused all that? Trump hates McConnell. So why did McConnell operate in that fashion? What led up to it? Talk a little bit about that arc you saw from that great Senate to the Senate that he led during the Trump presidency.
Well, look, I think that, and John knows better than I, because he was in not just Clinton, but he was in the Obama administration. Part of what I was saying here, when I lay this at the feet of McConnell, McConnell had done significant damage to our politics and our government long before Trump came down the escalator. I mean, we all focus understandably on Trump, but it was McConnell who obstructed 7 out of 8 years, let's say, of the Obama presidency with unprecedented obstruction from day one, maybe before day one.
Yeah, famously rallied the Senate caucus to oppose Obama before Obama was inaugurated.
Right, and there's a scene, and I have it in my second book, there's a scene when McConnell convenes the Senate Republican caucus right before Obama's taking office. And it's a dreary, rainy, cold day, and the mood is bad. The mood is bad, though, not because we're in the Great Recession, teetering on the verge of a depression. The mood is bad because Obama has high approval ratings. And so we're going to take them down from the beginning, irrespective. We'd still be in the Great Depression if it hadn't been for 3 Republicans, basically, who sided with the Democrats. But fast forward to the Trump years. McConnell, as far as I can tell, didn't think Trump was going to win. But he held open the vacancy on the Supreme Court just in case. And
for a year.
Yeah, for a year. And he also was very careful with Trump running. Paul Ryan was agonizing. All these Republicans were wringing their hands about him. McConnell never did that. He never saw any reason to criticize the nominee. So then Trump wins. And McConnell says, this is a real opportunity. How often do you have a united government with all Republicans? And he has his agenda, particularly packing the courts and specifically most the Supreme Court, cutting taxes for the rich, deregulation broadly, particularly in the environmental area, and of course the one thing he initially failed at, repealing the Affordable Care Act. And when I focus on McConnell, I focus on him because of the length of the damage that he's caused, but also Trump didn't run on taking away people's health care. That was something McConnell and Ryan sold him. So the damage he's caused has been very significant. Now, I do say, because I believe it, that he's a superb, I don't know if I use the word superb, but an excellent strategist and tactician, brutally difficult negotiator, very patient, and great knowledge of his donor base, which he plays to and raises money from and then rewards with legislative and regulatory activities. Look, I'd rate it, when you write a blistering indictment, you try very hard to be fair, So I gave him credit for everything he's done for the country, but it didn't take many pages.
Or many footnotes. Well, it was, he's operating in this tribal era of politics. How much do you think he contributed to creating that? I mean, a lot of people trace that back to Gingrich. What's your perspective on that?
I would argue that the two most influential people in shaping our politics before Donald Trump were Newt Gingrich and Mitch McConnell. Not identical. Gingrich, politics as war. McConnell doesn't quite say it that way, but it's victory at all costs, essentially the same way. And the trashing of norms, one after the other. I mean, we all know about what happened to Merrick Garland and anyone Obama would have nominated for the Supreme Court. But the trashing of norms that had to do with trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act without hearings or markups or Democrats or anything. One norm trashed after another. And I think the other thing I would add that I think is very important in our experience and in your experience, Senate leaders have a particular responsibility to try to make the institution work. They have a responsibility to reach across the aisle and establish trust and work together. That's the leaders we grew up with. That's leaders, even as the Senate weakened, Tom Daschle and Trent Lott worked that way. That's the special responsibility.
Or at least
of
that's the way
leaders.
they remember that they worked.
They had one or two times they worked that way. John was also a rather close advisor to Tom Daschle. But the leaders have a special responsibility. And McConnell was completely the opposite. If you look at the record, there's very few, if any, times that he tried to bring people together. He's a divider. He's the architect of division, in my opinion. He exacerbated everything rather than trying to ease tensions, and he's still doing it.
Do a little psychoanalysis for me. I mentioned that Trump hates him. So arguably, with the possible exception of the Space Force, Trump's only accomplishments, legislative accomplishments, were cutting taxes, which was McConnell's priority, and judges, which Trump had not thought much about, but you kind of credit Don McGahn and McConnell as getting Trump on that bandwagon. So why do you think that Trump hates McConnell so much, or do you think he does?
Well,
it seems like he does.
Well, you know why he hates him so much. I mean, McConnell gave two excellent speeches that he could be very proud of on January 6 and on February 13. He condemned Trump in no uncertain terms. Those were speeches as good or better than any Democrat gave about what Trump did to cause the insurrection. So Trump hates...
I don't think people actually remember that. Seriously.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, you should talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think they do remember it, actually. This crowd.
No, do you think they remember McConnell going out and making that argument?
Well, let's take a show of hands. Does anyone remember that? No,
Okay.
I mean,
all right.
McConnell gave an excellent speech on January 6th in the morning about the fact that Trump had lied about the election before the insurrection occurred, and that he was essentially lying about the whole thing. After the insurrection, and then we go to the impeachment trial, February 13th, after the case has been presented by Jamie Raskin and the other House managers, McConnell gives a superb speech about what Trump had done. I couldn't give a better speech than that. And then remember, he flips 180 degrees. But we can't really convict a former president, even though the Senate had already said, yeah, you can convict a former president. So I think Trump hates him for that, those speeches.
Yeah. And just to stick with that for a second, so he relies on sort of jurisdiction, procedural issues to say this isn't our business anymore.
Right. And of course, as Speaker Pelosi pointed out, he said he refused to accept the impeachment while Trump was still in office. Then he turns around and says, well, we can't convict a former president who's a former president because essentially it was late in the term and it was held up. No, I think Trump hates him, but the real question is how McConnell has managed to succeed and stay in power, right? I mean, you look at the House Republican leaders, and one after another, they've been thrown over the side of the road. You know, they're all there, Boehner and Cantor and, Gingrich, DeLay, all of them, one after another. McConnell has surfed the madness of the Republican Party. 16 years he'll be a leader. He will tie Mike Mansfield at the end of this year. So that's quite remarkable. It's quite horrible, actually. But it does show, it shows his skill. It shows the caucus has been loyal to him. He made them chairman at one time or another. He helps them raise money. They're loyal to him. And basically, it shows that we have tribal politics. And look, one of the things that I point out in the book, while I focus on McConnell, he couldn't have accomplished what he did if he didn't have all the Republicans with him. Where was Rob Portman? Where was Lamar Alexander? Where were Roy Blunt? The reason I was somewhat optimistic in the first year was because Jeff Flake and Bob Corker was speaking out very strongly. And John McCain was still there, which meant John McCain was an independent force and Lindsey Graham hadn't gone over to the dark side yet. So, but the independent people either retired or died, and pretty soon you're left with sort of Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski kind of worrying and trying and wringing their hands and getting things right or wrong. But they could have stopped him. I don't know what Portman and Alexander were thinking.
So a lot of people had the last clear chance, not just McConnell, to stop him.
Yeah, I think so.
But definitely in the second impeachment, it's on McConnell.
Well, McConnell has suggested that he couldn't really vote for impeachment because he didn't have enough other Senate Republicans. He would have had the Senate Republicans if he had done it. If he had been for it, there would have been 15 or 18 or 20. So,
Ira, do you think, given where politics had come to by the time Trump is in office, McConnell's the leader, that can you imagine a Republican leader who would have stood up to him, done something different?
Well, I think that I have the quote,
and state leader of the caucus. Maybe,
no.
I guess, maybe that.
I mean, one of the quotes that I have in the beginning of the book was a famous statement that Undersecretary of State George Ball made when he was opposing the Vietnam War escalation. And Ball said, "He who rides the tiger cannot choose where he dismounts." I think McConnell thought he could manage the situation. I think he underestimated Trump's depravity. I think he thought that the election would be over when he decided it was over, and he let it get out of hand. I think he made a lifetime of mistakes in the last 2 months after the election.
There's a lot of ink's been spilled and trees have been cut analyzing the fact that Republican elected officials are afraid of their voters. How much of that dynamic was at play in all of that?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I certainly think that the Republican senators were very aware that Trump had strong support in the party. They admired Jeff Flake for his courage, and they noted he was out of politics quickly. And Corker said he was going to retire anyway. So certainly that entered into it. And I've been around politics a long time. I don't expect great acts of courage all the time. People I worked for have disappointed me from time to time. But we're talking about the most serious assault on our constitutional order that's ever happened. I think that at that point you have to say, I've got a higher calling. I'm supposed to do something here. And the people that we grew up with, John, and that others in the room, I have no doubt that the Republican senators I knew at a different time would have stopped Trump, would have convicted Trump. I mean, Lowell Weicker, he'd killed Trump. Just to name one.
One of my favorite turns of words in the book was you described the Trump White House as a chaotic rat's nest of rivals. But you do that in service of a different point, which is that actually empowered McConnell. That the dysfunctionality in the White House gave him maybe a stronger hand to steer what he wanted, those three priorities that you mentioned.
Well, I think so, but I have to say that, Trump and the Republicans didn't have that many positive priorities. Trump was savvy enough to grasp quite quickly how important the Supreme Court was. I mean, during the campaign, when the idea was brought to him, you ought to commit to pro-life right-wing justices, and here's the list. If you endorse this list, you're going to put a lot of people at ease, and they're going to support you. And Trump got that right away. So whatever his views were, he knew that was a good thing to do.
Politically.
Yeah, he thought that would be good.
It anchored a Christian conservative base that was certainly skeptical of him at the beginning of the primaries.
Yes, exactly. He got the Christian conservative base. Now, 2 days from now, I'm not going to have this friendly an interlocutor because I'm going to be interviewed by the president of the Federalist Society. And one of the things that needs to be said about the Federalist Society, while there has always been the drive to get rid of Roe versus Wade, that's been central, the Federalist Society also existed to reduce government regulation, to remake the economy, to unleash the free enterprise economy. The Federalist Society was by and large funded by the Koch brothers, the Olin Corporation, the fossil fuel industry, etc. So there are the two strands that came together to be supportive of right-wing justices. But the Christian impetus, the Christian right and the Federalist Society have been, very close. And it was a long march for them. They've been doing it for 30 plus years.
Well, they finally caught the car.
Yeah. Well, we'll see if they caught the car.
I don't know. You're one of those people who want to wait and see what the final opinion looks like. You don't trust the draft.
No. I know what the final opinion will look like. To caught the car meant that somehow you caught the car and it's going to backfire on you politically.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So
that's fair enough.
We'll
fair
see.
enough. Fair enough.
We'll see.
Well, to your point, it's not just potential repeal of Roe versus Wade that's coming down, but West Virginia versus EPA may gut the authority to regulate public health, safety, and the environment, deal with climate change, etc. So those two things have come together with this now super conservative majority on the court.
Yeah, I I never used the word conservative, though, for them.
Radical.
Yeah, no, and former Republican Solicitor General Charles Fried used the word reactionary. I think that's the most charitable word. I think they're radicals. And just briefly, I'm rehearsing for my Federalist Society pitch. You have to understand that from Richard Nixon until the time Bill Clinton was elected, 24 years, the Senate confirmed 10 justices, 10 that were appointed by Republican presidents, 10 in a row, and it wasn't enough for the Federalist Society because they were moderate conservatives. Some of them turned out to be fair-minded, even liberal. And so the Federalist Society just kept working at it. This has been a radical movement.
I guess I'm going to get you ready for your Federalist Society interview. One of the things you lay at the Senate's feet is the botched COVID response. Now that, I think, would be a stretch for most people. It's easy to lay it at Trump's feet. Do you really think the Senate had a lot to do, and McConnell in particular, had a lot to do with the botched COVID response? I mean, he wasn't telling people to
fair.
drink Clorox.
No. I mean, I think that's a fair point, and I try to say in the book I point out that the Senate joined the House and the Trump administration in the CARES Act early, which was very important. And perhaps I think too much about McConnell, but after that, when more aid was needed, the House acted and McConnell and the Senate didn't act for months. 7 months went by, number one. And number two, I don't think it's enough when you have an unhinged president attacking the blue state governors and mayors, liberate Michigan, mocking masks and social distancing, inviting his supporters to a super spreader events. Obviously, that's on Trump. But what I'm suggesting is that senators should have spoken out and done more. And I think that McConnell's supporters would say he modeled good behavior. He wore a mask. He practiced social distancing.
Told people to get vaccinated.
Stayed far away from the White House. But I don't think that was enough. I think they should have used every effort to move him, Trump, through private persuasion. And if that didn't work, they should have been public. They should have done what senators did, Democratic and Republican, to try to stop the Vietnam War.
I'm going to let everybody else ask questions in a second. I'm going to ask you one more. But if you want to do that, you have to make your way to that microphone, which is over here to your right, stage left. So I invite people to wander up there at this point. Coming back to the court, I'd like to get your take on Justice Thomas recently gave a pretty controversial interview. And he said that Republicans wouldn't and shouldn't engage in the politics, of personal attack in confirmation hearings. So I'm assuming that he kind of slept through Ketanji Brown Jackson's hearings. But what did you think of where we went to in that hearing? Was it mean? She was obviously confirmed with Democratic votes, and picked up 2, I guess, Republican 3, I think, Republican votes. But what did it? What was the meaning of that to you?
Well, look, some Democrats are accused of having Trump derangement syndrome. I'm guilty of McConnell derangement syndrome. I always come back to McConnell. It would have been, I think, easy to confirm Judge Jackson, who was superbly qualified. It would have been easy to celebrate the elevation of the first African American woman justice. No, McConnell couldn't do that. It would have been okay, it seems to me, to say, look, she's superbly qualified, but I just think she's too liberal. Could have said that. No, she's the candidate of the radicals. Always, if there's a chance to make things better in the country by bringing people together, he never takes it. And the one thing I would add, I might add it in the questions, but the one thing I would add is I'm very happy that Senator McConnell went to Ukraine. I hope that he finds in President Zelensky and the courageous Ukrainian people a good example of what democracy means. But he's done great damage to our democracy, and he continues to do it. So the call to action is the 2022 elections actually really matter.
Cindy LeBeau.
Full disclosure, I've served with both of these fine gentlemen in positions in the Senate. And Ira, congratulations on your book and your tenacity to write 3 books, not just one. I want to say that the cover art of this book is some of the best cover art ever. And the reason I say that is because it portrays Mitch McConnell as he should be portrayed, as one of the most loathsome human beings, members of the Senate, political figures in American life. And I hope you're going to distribute copies of the book to him and to all of the Republicans in the Senate. They need to read it. But this is kind of a hard question, because I don't think that the blame lies entirely with Mitch McConnell and the Republicans. I think there have been times, and I'm just going to go from 2016 forward, and particularly my interest has been the Supreme Court nominations. I played an important role in the Bork defeat. When I saw Brett Kavanaugh appointed, I thought he looked like Robert Bork for 2018. I think the Democrats have sat on their hands. And I tried to play a role with the Kavanaugh nomination in particular to try and get people to think about the issues that were so critical before the court. And for weeks, I'm faxing in things from my office then at UCLA and in Los Angeles, trying to explain what privacy is and why the court matters and what's coming up on the court's agenda. And I got a lot of, oh, well, we're in Cape Cod, and gee, it's just going to take some work, and we're not ready to do that. And I think the Democrats have, unfortunately, in the Kavanaugh and the Barrett hearings in particular, have been an embarrassment. And so, you know, you guys are great strategists, great thinkers about our party. I'd like to know what you think can be done to change that point of view and get the Democrats really engaged in thinking outside the box and changing the picture in the Senate.
You want to answer that, John?
You're the book author. I helped Brian Fallon get demand justice going,
Right.
so that was my answer.
No, I was going to make part of that answer. Certainly Cindy's view is shared by a lot of Democrats. Brian Fallon, who used to work for Schumer, has broken with...
Now doesn't talk to him.
Doesn't talk to him because he was so critical of how weak Democrats were on nominations. And I agree with that. I think that I felt the Kavanaugh nomination is the only thing I've lobbied on for many, many years.
Right. And you and I did.
I went
did a
up,
little
I
lobbying
wrote
on
papers, I talked to senators, I talked to all the undecided senators with the exception of Lisa Murkowski, because I thought it was that important. I think the Democrats handled it miserably from the beginning. I always thought it should have been handled like Bork was handled. You know, he's an extremist, but you have to demonstrate it. And they didn't demonstrate it. The hearings were disgraceful. And then Dianne Feinstein compounded it by terribly mishandling the whole Christine Blasey Ford situation. So I agree with that. I'd like to think that Biden and Chuck Schumer are doing better in terms of getting judges through at this point. But there is something about the barn, the horse being out and the barn door closed. Look, McConnell threw 4 thunderbolts in 5 years. Preventing Garland, changing the rules on filibustering Supreme Court nominations, saving Kavanaugh after the National Catholic Council of Churches had broken with Kavanaugh, and then ramming through Amy Coney Barrett. It's very difficult to deal with somebody like that when the Democrats, even when they're united, didn't have any Republican support.
Okay,
John.
thanks.
I think that's John Lawrence.
Yeah, he's there somewhere.
It's hard with the masks.
I wanted to follow up on your observation of your focus on McConnell, because there is an underlying issue here in terms of restoring public confidence in the Senate that goes beyond the current leadership. You may detect a certain House bias here, which is somewhat excusable, but even if there weren't a Mitch McConnell, the Senate seems to me to face some serious credibility problems with the American people because of its fundamental design, which is, moved from a 13-to-1 ratio to a 70-to-1 ratio, and so vastly overrepresents a particular group of states which tend to be smaller, tend to be less populated and more conservative, because it dramatically underrepresents minorities as compared to the House of Representatives, which is the 6th straight House now where the diversity representation is greater than in the preceding House. And because in the Senate you obviously have states that elect senators, elect conservatives with significant minority populations, but not large enough to influence the Senate vote, and so you end up with a tiny fraction of minorities who are not receptive in the Senate not being as receptive as the House. And then the third being the emphasis on the supermajority through the filibuster. All of those things, and I'm reporting here directly from the 18-year-olds in my class, really have, I think, created such a level of skepticism and disdain towards the institution that goes beyond individuals. And I'm just wondering, I know you've done some thinking yourself around the filibuster issue, but there's a bigger challenge, it seems to me, with respect to the Senate regaining the level of public trust that it had, notwithstanding the fact that in the 70s and 80s, many of these problems existed at that time as well. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on those issues that go beyond Mitch McConnell and the current composition of the Senate.
Good question.
This is John Lawrence, who has only served 38 years in the House and as Chief of Staff to the Speaker, and in 8 years or 10 years, and is coming out with a book on Speaker Pelosi's leadership from 2006 to 10. So it'd be a great book later in the year. Look, I agree with all that. Interestingly, you never, when we were there and when the Senate worked, you didn't hear all that much about the 2 senators from each state. In large part, even though the populations were disparate, the differentials, in large part because there were so many good small state senators who were real senators. And there were Democrats from all over the country, so you didn't really worry about it too much. Since it's gone as polarized as it has, it becomes a very serious problem. So I agree, the Senate's going to lack legitimacy. My answer, to the extent I have an answer, my answer has been remove any of the impediments you can that stand in the way of majority rule. And by that I would include the filibuster, and I would get rid of holds. I would make changes in the rules to remove those impediments. But my real answer is to have senators who are like senators, who recognize that they're not just partisan hacks on the one hand, and they're not state legislators on the other hand. And I would say in the current moment, the challenge that we face in the next 5.5 months is defeat as many Republicans as possible and see if a Senate that had 54 or 55 Democrats, which is possible, can work better.
Admit the District of Columbia as a state. And if the people of Puerto Rico want to be a state, same. Go ahead.
Yeah, congratulations, Ira.
Could you identify
Oh,
yourself?
sorry, my name's Louis Schrager. So I just thought I wanted to sort of look forward. You know, as you say, we've got the Senate for 5.5, 6 months. And right now, you know, we have the ability to pass legislation due to its makeup, but there are a couple of Democratic senators that are impeding that. And so much of what the election in 2022 might look like depend on potentially changing their perspectives. With your knowledge of the Senate, what advice would you give to those who are negotiating with Manchin and to a certain extent Sinema? What kind of deals would you try to cut that would make at least some legislation possible that could make a difference as we went into the election?
I don't know how John feels, but I actually can't think of a precedent for Manchin. A person, I mean, the normal politics that we're familiar with was sort of expressed by Dick Durbin, who said, well, Joe's put his mark on the legislation. He's gotten some things, so I assumed he was going to go along with it. But the list is infinite. It never changes. He's a very, 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 conservative Democrat, putting it mildly. My answer on this is actually to elect more Democrats. Manchin said at one point, if you don't like it, you ought to elect more liberals. That's my answer. If we had 54, then he doesn't matter as much.
And you think that's possible?
We disempower. I do believe it's possible. The map is favorable. There's many more, 20 Republican seats up as opposed to 14 Democrats, 5 Republican retirements as opposed to 1 Democrat. We've got some really good candidates. They've got some really bad candidates. So I do think it's possible.
I want to come back to the election, but I wanted to let Ken get a question in first.
Okay.
Well,
Well, I'm going to ask a question dealing with the election, so you could.
Good. Go ahead. Maybe you'll ask my question.
You may have answered it a little bit by your last.
Identify
I'm
yourself,
sorry. I'm Ken Ackerman, and full disclosure, I was part of the Senate group back in the day as well. One of the ones working on the Republican side of the aisle, back when Republicans were good. But when many Republicans were good. My question is this. Ira, you mentioned there's a reasonable chance the Democrats could get more Democratic senators elected this year, which would make McConnell less relevant. But the opposite of that is possible too. And it's very possible the polls right now are very adverse. It's very possible McConnell may be the majority leader again next year. It's very possible he may be coming back with just as many senators as he has now. So he's not going anyplace, at least the way it looks right now. That being the case, how would you and John both really, advise Joe Biden on how he can deal with McConnell in the last 2.5 years of this term? There are issues the country has to face. There are legislative priorities that are not just on Biden's list, but on the country's list. If you're Joe Biden, how do you deal with Mitch McConnell? Obviously, he's not your friend, but he's the minority leader, potentially majority leader of the Senate. Do you try to make him your friend? Do you try to cut deals with him? Do you try to bring him in your circle? Do you ignore him and push him away and try to go? What do you do?
Well, I'd like to hear from John about this. I'll comment briefly and then see what he thinks, because he's a great strategist and also has thought a lot about what you can do through legislation as opposed to what you can do through executive authority. I think McConnell's incorrigible. I don't think you can make him your friend. I think that he would, if he were a majority leader, he would continue to obstruct anything the president did. There might be, he occasionally makes a judgment that it's better to do something like the infrastructure bill than nothing. But for the most part, it'll be mostly nothing. I would encourage Biden at that point, if he was asking, I would be Harry Truman running against the do-nothing Congress. I would be, I would lay it out that way. And I would use executive authority to the fullest extent possible, even while recognizing that you're going to lose a lot in court.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree with that. I mean, we lived in the Clinton years with 6 years of Republican control in both the House and the Senate. And I think there were, the one thing I would say that was where we had the upper hand was in the appropriations process. But that was because the Republicans feared they lost so badly the fight around shutting the government down that they understood that a president who was willing to veto legislation, even to the point of shutting the government down, would inure to their detriment. And Clinton got a lot of things done through the appropriations process in those last years. There were a few things where and I think this would be true with McConnell, particularly in the foreign affairs and international relations area, where he doesn't want to, I think the Post just did a story about him trying not to position the Republican Party as an isolationist party where you might find some common ground. The Ukraine bill just passed, right, Bill? So there might be a few places to pick your shots, but I think largely you have to take that argument to the American people, explain what you're trying to do, explain why they're obstructing it. And we're nearly out of time. I want maybe you to conclude with where you kind of end the book, which is advice to Democrats about how to run the race in 2022.
Well, thanks. Do you have any other? Look, I think that somebody said to me, well, that's a good book, but it's pretty depressing. And I said, well, no, it ends with a call to action. And that's the 2022 Senate elections. And I think that while Democrats have a tendency, everyone has their own priorities, and we understand that. But if you want a unified position among Democrats, it's that diminishing McConnell's power would be a good thing. Beating Senate Republicans would be a good thing. If you list the 5 things that upset you most about this country, with the exception of inflation, he's at the intersection of all of them. Responsible for all of it. Environmental, guns, health, attacks on health care, the courts, inequality, everything. It all comes back to McConnell and the Senate Republicans. So I would add him and the Senate Republicans as a talking point to anything I was doing. We got some really good candidates coming up, and I'm cautiously optimistic. I'd be more optimistic except for my track record. My political predictions were quite brilliant in the 20th century. We're 22 years into this one, not so great.
One of the things that the president's moved towards is, I think, recognizing that the public feels like the Republican Party has really changed, gone off the rails, lives in a conspiracy land. He started really hammering on MAGA Republicans. Yeah. You think that's smart?
Oh, I do think it's smart. I think, look, The Trump voters are not going to be brought around. They'll be where they are. But I think drawing the line sharply, trying to get independents and disillusioned Republicans is a good strategy. And that's the Truman strategy, basically. Give them hell.
Okay, back to 1948.
So if you don't feel riled up after listening to these two guys, I don't know what'll do it. Thank you both, Ira and John. Copies of Ira's book are available at the checkout desk. He'll be up here signing. Please form a line to the right of the table and help our staff by folding up the chairs.